The sun burned high above the Texas plains as Jake wiped sweat from his forehead with a dusty sleeve. He had been working the Henderson Ranch for 3 years now, and the endless stretch of dry grassland still amazed him every morning. The cattle were scattered across the eastern pasture, their low calls echoing in the hot air as they searched for patches of green grass. Jake rode his horse, Thunder, along the fence line, checking for breaks in the wire. It was tedious work, but someone had to do it. The ranch was huge, stretching for miles in every direction, and Mr. Henderson trusted Jake to keep everything running smoothly when he was away on business. As Thunder's hooves clicked against the hard ground, Jake noticed something unusual near the old creek bed. The creek had been dry for months due to the harsh summer, but there was movement near the rocky outcrop where water used to flow. At first he thought it might be a wounded animal, perhaps a deer that had gotten caught in the thorny bushes that grew wild in that area. Jake guided Thunder closer, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Living on a ranch meant being prepared for anything, from wild animals to cattle thieves. But as he got nearer, he realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a man, and he was in serious trouble. The stranger lay crumpled against the rocks, his clothes torn and stained with blood. His long black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and strange markings covered his arms and face. Jake had never seen anything like the intricate patterns painted on the man's skin, but he knew immediately that this was a Native American warrior, probably from one of the tribes that still roamed the far reaches of the territory. Jake's heart pounded as he dismounted Thunder. Relations between the ranchers and the local tribes had been tense for years. There had been raids, stolen cattle, and worse. Most of the ranch hands had been told to shoot first and ask questions later if they encountered any tribal warriors on Henderson land. But looking at this man, barely conscious and clearly dying of thirst, Jake couldn't bring himself to reach for his weapon. The warrior's eyes fluttered open as Jake approached. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with pain and suspicion. The man tried to sit up, but his strength failed him, and he collapsed back against the rocks with a groan that made Jake wince. "Easy there," Jake said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt pretty bad." The warrior's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. His breathing was shallow and labored. Jake could see that without water soon, this man would die under the scorching sun. There were no clouds in the sky, no promise of rain, and the nearest town was a full day's ride away. Jake looked around nervously. He was completely alone out here, miles from the main ranch house. If anyone found out he had helped a tribal warrior instead of capturing or killing him, there would be serious consequences. Mr. Henderson had made his position on Indian troubles very clear during Jake's first week on the job. But as Jake stared down at the dying man, he thought about his own father, who had raised him to believe that all people deserved basic human kindness. His father had been a simple farmer back in Missouri, and he had always said that a man's character was measured by how he treated those who couldn't help themselves. The warrior's eyes followed Jake's movements as he walked back to Thunder and retrieved his water canteen. It was nearly full, enough to last Jake the rest of the day if he was careful. But this man needed it more than he did. Jake knelt beside the warrior and gently lifted his head. "Here," he said, bringing the canteen to the man's lips. "Drink slowly." The warrior's eyes widened with surprise, but he didn't resist. He drank eagerly at first, then more slowly as Jake warned him to take it easy. Color began to return to his face and his breathing became more regular. "What happened to you?" Jake asked, though he didn't expect an answer. The man probably didn't speak English, but the warrior surprised him by speaking in heavily accented but clear English. "Horse fell," he managed to say. 3 days. No water." Jake nodded, understanding. The warrior had been thrown from his horse and had been stranded in this desolate area for 3 days without water. It was a miracle he was still alive. As the warrior continued to drink, Jake noticed the intricate beadwork on his clothing and the quality of his weapons. This wasn't just any tribal member. The elaborate decorations and fine craftsmanship suggested that this man held an important position in his tribe, perhaps even a chief or war leader. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jake knew he needed to get back to the ranch soon, but he couldn't just leave the warrior here to die. At the same time, he couldn't risk bringing him back to the ranch house. Mr. Henderson and the other hands would never understand. "Can you ride?" Jake asked, gesturing toward Thunder. The warrior tested his strength, managing to sit up straighter. He was still weak, but the water had helped considerably. He shook his head slowly. "Tomorrow," he said in his broken English. "Tomorrow, stronger." Jake made a decision that he knew could change his life forever. He removed his bedroll from Thunder's back and spread it out in the shade of the largest rock. Then he took out his small supply of jerky and hardtack biscuits, sharing them with the warrior. "I'll come back tomorrow," Jake promised, knowing he was taking an enormous risk. "Same time. I'll bring more water and food." The warrior studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if trying to understand why this white rancher would help him. Finally, he spoke a single word in his native language, then translated it to English. "Brother," he said simply. As Jake rode back toward the ranch house under the star-filled sky, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. He had just made a promise to help a man who, according to everything he had been taught, was supposed to be his enemy. But something deep in his heart told him he had done the right thing. The next morning would bring new challenges, and Jake had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would change not only his own life, but the entire relationship between the Henderson Ranch and the tribal nations of the region. Jake barely slept that night. He tossed and turned in his narrow bunk, thinking about the warrior he had left by the old creek bed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's grateful face and heard his voice saying, "Brother." The word echoed in his mind, carrying a weight that Jake didn't fully understand. When the rooster crowed at dawn, Jake was already awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of the bunkhouse. The other ranch hands were still sleeping soundly after a hard day's work. Tom Bradley, the foreman, snored loudly in the corner bunk, while young Billy Martinez mumbled in his sleep about cattle and fence posts. Jake dressed quietly and slipped out into the cool morning air. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painted in soft shades of purple and gold. He made his way to the kitchen where Maria, the ranch cook, was already preparing breakfast for the hands. "You're up early, Jake," Maria said with a knowing smile. She was a kind woman in her 50s, who had worked for the Henderson family for over 20 years. "Something on your mind?" "Just couldn't sleep," Jake replied, trying to sound casual. "Thought I'd get an early start on checking the north pasture." Maria studied his face with the intuition of someone who had raised 5 children of her own. "You look troubled, mijo. Is everything okay?" Jake forced a smile and filled his water canteen at the pump. "Everything's fine, Maria. Just want to get ahead of the heat today." He grabbed some extra biscuits and jerky from the kitchen supplies, stuffing them into his saddlebags when Maria wasn't looking. He felt guilty about taking the food without permission, but he couldn't exactly explain why he needed extra provisions. Thunder was waiting in the corral, seeming to sense Jake's urgency. The horse whinnied softly as Jake approached with the saddle. Within minutes, they were heading out across the ranch toward the old creek bed, the morning mist still clinging to the grass. As they rode, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if the warrior had died during the night? What if he had managed to leave on his own? What if other tribal members had found him? Each scenario brought its own set of problems and fears. The sun was climbing higher by the time Jake reached the rocky outcrop where he had left the warrior. His heart sank when he didn't immediately see the man, but then he heard a voice call out from behind a large boulder. "You came back." The warrior emerged from the shadows, looking much stronger than he had the day before. The water and food had done their work, and though he still moved carefully, he was clearly on the path to recovery. His dark eyes held a mixture of surprise and respect as he looked at Jake. "I promised I would," Jake replied, dismounting from Thunder. He retrieved the extra water and food from his saddlebags and offered them to the warrior. "What is your name?" the warrior asked as he accepted the provisions gratefully. Jake Morrison. What's yours?" "I am called Running Bear," the man replied. "I am son of Chief White Eagle of the Kiowa people." Jake's blood ran cold. He had just saved the son of one of the most powerful chiefs in the territory. Chief White Eagle was legendary among the ranchers and settlers, known for his fierce protection of tribal lands and his strategic brilliance in conflicts with the cavalry. If anyone discovered that Jake had helped Running Bear, it would be seen as treason by his own people. "Your father is Chief White Eagle?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Running Bear nodded solemnly. "He leads our people with wisdom and strength. For many seasons he has tried to keep peace with the white settlers, but it becomes more difficult each year." Jake sat down on a nearby rock, suddenly feeling the full weight of his situation. My boss, Mr. Henderson, he's not exactly friendly toward your people. If he knew I was here— You are afraid, Running Bear observed, but there was no judgment in his voice. That is wise. There is much anger between our peoples. Then why are you telling me who you are? Running Bear was quiet for a moment, chewing on a piece of jerky and studying Jake's face. Because you gave water to a dying man without asking his name or his tribe. You saw only someone who needed help. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the simple meal and watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Jake found himself relaxing despite the dangerous situation. There was something calming about Running Bear's presence, a quiet strength that reminded Jake of his father. How did you end up here? Jake asked eventually. Running Bear's expression grew serious. I was scouting the boundaries of our territory. There have been reports of new settlers moving closer to our sacred places. My horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and threw me. I hit my head on the rocks and was unconscious for many hours. Jake nodded, understanding the implications. The tribe was keeping watch on the expanding settlements, and Running Bear had been gathering intelligence about potential threats to their land. My people will be looking for me, Running Bear continued. When I do not return, they will send search parties. The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. Search parties meant warriors, probably armed and angry about their missing chief's son. If they found evidence that Running Bear had been on Henderson land, there could be serious consequences for everyone on the ranch. How long before they start looking? Jake asked. They expected me back yesterday at sunset. By now my father has sent riders to search. Jake stood up and began pacing. We need to get you back to your people and fast. Can you ride? Running Bear tested his strength standing up and walking around the small clearing. He was still sore and moved with some difficulty, but he was clearly much improved from the day before. I can ride, but my horse is gone. It ran away when I fell. Jake looked at Thunder, then back at Running Bear. You can take my horse. I'll walk back to the ranch and tell them Thunder threw a shoe or something. No, Running Bear said firmly. That would bring suspicion on you. There must be another way. As they discussed options, neither man noticed the dust cloud rising in the distance, growing larger as it approached their location. A group of riders was heading their way, moving fast across the open plain. Running Bear spotted them first. He shielded his eyes against the sun and studied the approaching figures. His face grew tense. Kiowa warriors, he said quietly. 6 of them. They are my father's best scouts. Jake felt his heart racing. In a matter of minutes, he would be face to face with a war party of Kiowa warriors while alone with their chief's son. Every story he had ever heard about such encounters ended badly for the white man. What do I do? Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. Running Bear placed a gentle but firm hand on Jake's arm. Do not reach for your weapon. I will speak for you. But Jake Morrison, what happens next will depend on how much my father values the life of his son. The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, and Jake realized that his simple act of kindness was about to be put to the ultimate test. The 6 Kiowa warriors approached like thunder rolling across the plain. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rocky walls of the creek bed. Jake's mouth went dry as he watched them come closer, their war paint gleaming in the sunlight and their weapons clearly visible. Running Bear stepped forward, placing himself between Jake and the approaching riders. He raised his hand in greeting and called out in the Kiowa language, his voice strong and clear despite his recent ordeal. The lead warrior, a tall man with gray streaks in his long hair, responded with obvious relief and joy. The riders pulled their horses to a halt just yards away from where Jake stood frozen. The leader dismounted and rushed to Running Bear, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the emotion was clear. These men had been desperately worried about their chief's son. The gray-haired warrior examined Running Bear's injuries with gentle hands, checking his head and asking questions. Running Bear answered patiently, occasionally glancing back at Jake with reassuring nods. But Jake noticed that the other 5 warriors kept their eyes fixed on him, their hands resting on their weapons. One of the younger warriors, his face painted with red and black stripes, spoke harshly to Running Bear while pointing at Jake. The anger in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake didn't need a translation to understand that the warrior was questioning why a white man was present at this reunion. Running Bear's response was calm but firm. He spoke at length, gesturing between himself and Jake, pointing to the empty water canteen and the remains of their shared meal. As he talked, Jake watched the expressions on the warriors' faces change from suspicion to surprise to something that looked almost like respect. The gray-haired leader, who Jake realized must be some kind of war chief or senior warrior, studied Jake with intelligent eyes. He asked Running Bear several questions, receiving detailed answers each time. Finally, he walked slowly toward Jake, his weathered face serious but not hostile. "I am Stormhawk," the warrior said in careful English. "I lead the search for our chief's son. Running Bear tells me you saved his life." Jake swallowed hard and found his voice. "I just gave him water. Anyone would have done the same." Stormhawk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Would they?" "In our experience, white men who find injured Kiowa warriors do not offer water and food. They offer bullets." The blunt words hit Jake like a physical blow. He realized how rare his act of kindness must have seemed to these people, given the history of violence between their communities. "Running Bear was dying," Jake said simply. "I couldn't just leave him." Stormhawk nodded slowly, then turned back to Running Bear and spoke in Kiowa. The conversation that followed was intense, with several of the warriors joining in. Jake caught his own name mentioned several times, along with words he didn't recognize, but that seemed to carry great importance. Finally, Stormhawk returned to Jake. "Running Bear wishes to bring you to our village to meet his father, Chief White Eagle. He says you have shown honor and should be recognized by our people." Jake's heart nearly stopped. Visit a Kiowa village? Meet the legendary Chief White Eagle? It sounded like either a great honor or a death sentence, and Jake wasn't sure which. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but I need to get back to the ranch. My boss will be wondering where I am." Stormhawk translated this to the group, and several of the warriors laughed, though not unkindly. Running Bear stepped forward and placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. "My friend," he said, "you do not understand. By saving my life, you have created a debt that my father must acknowledge. In our culture, such debts are sacred. You cannot simply return to your work and pretend this never happened." Jake looked around at the circle of warriors, all watching him intently. Thunder stood nearby, occasionally snorting and pawing at the ground, sensing the tension in the air. "What if I don't come with you?" Jake asked. Stormhawk's expression grew serious. "Then we would understand that you do not wish to accept our friendship." But Running Bear would be shamed before his people for failing to bring his rescuer to receive proper thanks. Jake realized he was trapped in a web of cultural obligations he didn't fully understand. These people operated by codes of honor that were foreign to him, but clearly meant everything to them. "How long would I need to stay?" he asked. "1 day, perhaps 2, Running Bear replied. "Long enough for my father to express our gratitude properly. Long enough for you to understand that not all Kiowa are your enemies." Jake thought about Mr. Henderson and the other ranch hands. How could he explain disappearing for 2 days without notice? But as he looked at Running Bear's hopeful face and the respectful expressions of the warriors, he realized he couldn't refuse. These people were offering him something precious, a chance to see beyond the fear and prejudice that had always separated their communities. "All right," Jake said finally. "I'll come with you, but I need to get word to the ranch somehow so they don't think I'm dead or captured." Stormhawk smiled for the first time since arriving. "That can be arranged. We will send a message that you are safe and will return soon." One of the younger warriors produced a spare horse, a beautiful painted mare with intelligent eyes. As Jake prepared to mount, Running Bear approached him again. "You are nervous," the chief's son observed. "Wouldn't you be?" Jake replied with a weak smile. "When I was a boy," Running Bear said, "I was told many stories about white men. Most of them were tales of violence and broken promises. But my grandfather, who was wise beyond his years, told me that every people has both good and bad among them. Today I learned that my grandfather was right." Jake mounted the painted mare, surprised by how smoothly she moved beneath him. As the group prepared to ride toward the Kiowa village, Stormhawk came alongside him. "You should know," the war chief said quietly, "that there are some in our village who will not welcome a white man, regardless of what you have done for Running Bear. Stay close to us, speak respectfully, and remember that you are a guest in a land that has seen much pain." As they rode away from the creek bed, Jake turned back once to look at the place where he had made a simple decision to offer water to a thirsty man. He had no way of knowing that this spot would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come, or that his act of kindness was about to change the course of history for both his people and the Kiowa nation. The village lay ahead, hidden somewhere in the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. With each step their horses took, Jake moved further from everything familiar and deeper into a world that would challenge everything he thought he knew about friendship, honor, and what it meant to be human. The 6 Kiowa warriors approached like thunder rolling across the plain. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rocky walls of the creek bed. Jake's mouth went dry as he watched them come closer, their war paint gleaming in the sunlight and their weapons clearly visible. Running Bear stepped forward, placing himself between Jake and the approaching riders. He raised his hand in greeting and called out in the Kiowa language, his voice strong and clear despite his recent ordeal. The lead warrior, a tall man with gray streaks in his long hair, responded with obvious relief and joy. The riders pulled their horses to a halt just yards away from where Jake stood frozen. The leader dismounted and rushed to Running Bear, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the emotion was clear. These men had been desperately worried about their chief's son. The gray-haired warrior examined Running Bear's injuries with gentle hands, checking his head and asking questions. Running Bear answered patiently, occasionally glancing back at Jake with reassuring nods. But Jake noticed that the other 5 warriors kept their eyes fixed on him, their hands resting on their weapons. One of the younger warriors, his face painted with red and black stripes, spoke harshly to Running Bear while pointing at Jake. The anger in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake didn't need a translation to understand that the warrior was questioning why a white man was present at this reunion. Running Bear's response was calm but firm. He spoke at length, gesturing between himself and Jake, pointing to the empty water canteen and the remains of their shared meal. As he talked, Jake watched the expressions on the warriors' faces change from suspicion to surprise to something that looked almost like respect. The gray-haired leader, who Jake realized must be some kind of war chief or senior warrior, studied Jake with intelligent eyes. He asked Running Bear several questions, receiving detailed answers each time. Finally, he walked slowly toward Jake, his weathered face serious but not hostile. "I am Stormhawk," the warrior said in careful English. "I lead the search for our chief's son. Running Bear tells me you saved his life." Jake swallowed hard and found his voice. "I just gave him water. Anyone would have done the same." Stormhawk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Would they?" "In our experience, white men who find injured Kiowa warriors do not offer water and food. They offer bullets." The blunt words hit Jake like a physical blow. He realized how rare his act of kindness must have seemed to these people, given the history of violence between their communities. "Running Bear was dying," Jake said simply. "I couldn't just leave him." Stormhawk nodded slowly, then turned back to Running Bear and spoke in Kiowa. The conversation that followed was intense, with several of the warriors joining in. Jake caught his own name mentioned several times, along with words he didn't recognize, but that seemed to carry great importance. Finally, Stormhawk returned to Jake. "Running Bear wishes to bring you to our village to meet his father, Chief White Eagle. He says you have shown honor and should be recognized by our people." Jake's heart nearly stopped. Visit a Kiowa village? Meet the legendary Chief White Eagle? It sounded like either a great honor or a death sentence, and Jake wasn't sure which. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but I need to get back to the ranch. My boss will be wondering where I am." Stormhawk translated this to the group, and several of the warriors laughed, though not unkindly. Running Bear stepped forward and placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. "My friend," he said, "you do not understand. By saving my life, you have created a debt that my father must acknowledge. In our culture, such debts are sacred. You cannot simply return to your work and pretend this never happened." Jake looked around at the circle of warriors, all watching him intently. Thunder stood nearby, occasionally snorting and pawing at the ground, sensing the tension in the air. "What if I don't come with you?" Jake asked. Stormhawk's expression grew serious. "Then we would understand that you do not wish to accept our friendship." But Running Bear would be shamed before his people for failing to bring his rescuer to receive proper thanks. Jake realized he was trapped in a web of cultural obligations he didn't fully understand. These people operated by codes of honor that were foreign to him, but clearly meant everything to them. "How long would I need to stay?" he asked. "1 day, perhaps 2, Running Bear replied. "Long enough for my father to express our gratitude properly. Long enough for you to understand that not all Kiowa are your enemies." Jake thought about Mr. Henderson and the other ranch hands. How could he explain disappearing for 2 days without notice? But as he looked at Running Bear's hopeful face and the respectful expressions of the warriors, he realized he couldn't refuse. These people were offering him something precious, a chance to see beyond the fear and prejudice that had always separated their communities. "All right," Jake said finally. "I'll come with you, but I need to get word to the ranch somehow so they don't think I'm dead or captured." Stormhawk smiled for the first time since arriving. "That can be arranged. We will send a message that you are safe and will return soon." One of the younger warriors produced a spare horse, a beautiful painted mare with intelligent eyes. As Jake prepared to mount, Running Bear approached him again. "You are nervous," the chief's son observed. "Wouldn't you be?" Jake replied with a weak smile. "When I was a boy," Running Bear said, "I was told many stories about white men. Most of them were tales of violence and broken promises. But my grandfather, who was wise beyond his years, told me that every people has both good and bad among them. Today I learned that my grandfather was right." Jake mounted the painted mare, surprised by how smoothly she moved beneath him. As the group prepared to ride toward the Kiowa village, Stormhawk came alongside him. "You should know," the war chief said quietly, "that there are some in our village who will not welcome a white man, regardless of what you have done for Running Bear. Stay close to us, speak respectfully, and remember that you are a guest in a land that has seen much pain." As they rode away from the creek bed, Jake turned back once to look at the place where he had made a simple decision to offer water to a thirsty man. He had no way of knowing that this spot would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come, or that his act of kindness was about to change the course of history for both his people and the Kiowa nation. The village lay ahead, hidden somewhere in the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. With each step their horses took, Jake moved further from everything familiar and deeper into a world that would challenge everything he thought he knew about friendship, honor, and what it meant to be human. The Kiowa village appeared like something from a dream as they crested the final hill. Dozens of tall teepees stretched across a wide valley, their decorated hides fluttering gently in the afternoon breeze. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Jake could see people moving between the structures, going about their daily lives in a rhythm that seemed as old as the land itself. As their small group descended toward the village, Jake noticed children running ahead to announce their arrival. Their high voices carried across the valley, and soon people began emerging from their homes to see who was returning. Jake felt hundreds of eyes upon him as they rode closer, and he was acutely aware that he was probably the first white man many of these people had ever seen up close. The reaction was mixed. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed open hostility. Jake kept his eyes forward and his hands visible, remembering Stormhawk's warning about being respectful. The painted mare beneath him seemed to sense his nervousness and walked with careful, measured steps. Running Bear rode beside him, calling out greetings to various people in their native language. He seemed to be explaining Jake's presence because Jake caught his own name mentioned repeatedly, always followed by what sounded like explanations or reassurances. In the center of the village stood the largest teepee Jake had ever seen. It was decorated with intricate painted scenes of buffalo hunts and battles, and eagle feathers hung from its peak. As they approached this impressive structure, the entrance flap opened and a man emerged who could only be Chief White Eagle. The chief was smaller than Jake had expected, perhaps 60 years old with silver-streaked hair that fell past his shoulders. But there was something commanding about his presence that made him seem larger than life. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen both great joy and terrible sorrow, and his dark eyes held a wisdom that seemed to penetrate right through to Jake's soul. Running Bear dismounted quickly and went to his father, speaking rapidly in Kiowa while gesturing toward Jake. The chief listened carefully, asking occasional questions and nodding thoughtfully. Jake remained on his horse, unsure of the proper protocol, until Stormhawk signaled for him to dismount. As Jake's feet touched the ground, Chief White Eagle approached him. The entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how their leader would receive this unexpected white visitor. "Jake Morrison," the chief said in excellent English, his voice deep and resonant. "My son tells me that you saved his life when you could have left him to die. Is this true?" "Yes, sir," Jake replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I found him by the old creek bed. He needed water." Chief White Eagle studied Jake's face for a long moment. And you knew he was Kiowa when you helped him? Jake nodded. Yes, sir. I could tell from his clothing and markings. Yet you helped him anyway, knowing that your people and mine have been enemies. He was dying, Jake said simply. I couldn't just ride away and let that happen. A murmur went through the crowd that had gathered around them. Chief White Eagle translated Jake's words into Kiowa, and Jake saw some expressions soften, though others remained skeptical. Come, the chief said, placing a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. We will talk more in my lodge. There is much to discuss. The interior of Chief White Eagle's teepee was both simpler and more magnificent than Jake had imagined. Buffalo robes covered the ground and painted shields and weapons hung from the walls. A small fire burned in the center, and the smoke rose through an opening at the top, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Chief White Eagle gestured for Jake to sit across from him, while Running Bear took a place at his father's side. An elderly woman, whom Jake guessed was Running Bear's mother, served them a meal of roasted meat and corn cakes, along with a drink made from berries that was both sweet and refreshing. My son tells me you are a ranch hand, the chief said as they ate. You work for a man named Henderson. Jake nearly choked on his food. You know Mr. Henderson? Chief White Eagle's expression grew stern. I know of him. He has been taking more and more land that was promised to my people. His cattle eat the grass where our horses once grazed. His fences block the paths our ancestors used for countless generations. Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. He was beginning to understand that his simple act of kindness had thrust him into the middle of a much larger conflict. I just work for him, Jake said carefully. I don't make decisions about land or cattle. But you see what happens, the chief replied. You see how the white settlements grow larger while our territory grows smaller. You see how promises are broken like dry twigs in the wind. Jake couldn't deny what he had observed during his time at the ranch. New settlers arrived regularly, claiming land that had clearly been used by native peoples for generations. He had seen the evidence in the old trails, the sacred burial grounds, and the seasonal camps that dotted the landscape. What do you want from me? Jake asked honestly. Chief White Eagle was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had made a difficult decision. My son's life is precious to me beyond words. By saving him, you have created a bond between us that cannot be broken. But more than that, you have shown me that not all white men are driven by greed and hatred. He paused and looked directly at Jake. I want to offer you something that no white man has ever been offered before. I want to make you an honorary member of our tribe, with all the rights and protections that brings. You would always be welcome in our village, and our warriors would defend you as they would defend one of our own. Jake was speechless. The honor being offered was beyond anything he could have imagined. But he also understood the implications. Accepting would mean dividing his loyalties between two worlds that were increasingly at odds with each other. There's more, Chief White Eagle continued. I want you to be a bridge between our peoples. You have seen both sides now. You know that we are not the savage warriors your people believe us to be, just as we have learned that not all white men are heartless invaders. Running Bear leaned forward. There is going to be trouble soon, Jake. More settlers are coming, and the government soldiers are planning to force us onto smaller reservations. Both sides are preparing for war. But maybe, Chief White Eagle said, if someone like you could help us talk to the good people among the white settlers, we could find a way to avoid the bloodshed that seems inevitable. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. These people were asking him to risk everything he had known and trusted to help broker peace between two cultures that seemed destined for conflict. I need time to think about this, Jake said finally. Chief White Eagle nodded approvingly. A wise man considers carefully before making promises he might not be able to keep. You will stay with us tonight as our honored guest. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, you can give me your answer. As the evening wore on, Jake was introduced to many members of the tribe. He met warriors who shared stories of battles and hunts, elders who spoke of the old days when the buffalo darkened the plains, and children who stared at him with wide, curious eyes. Each interaction challenged his preconceptions and forced him to see these people as individuals, rather than the faceless enemy he had been taught to fear. That night, as Jake lay on a comfortable bed of buffalo robes in a guest teepee, he stared up at the stars through the smoke hole and wondered what dawn would bring. The choice before him would determine not only his own fate, but possibly the fate of two people standing on the brink of war. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of horses approaching the village. The thundering hooves and urgent voices outside his guest teepee told him that something was wrong. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find the village in a state of controlled chaos. Warriors were arming themselves, women were gathering children, and messengers were running between the teepees with urgent news. Stormhawk appeared at Jake's side, his face grim in the pale morning light. "Soldiers," he said simply. "A full cavalry unit, perhaps 50 men, riding hard toward our village. They will be here within the hour." Jake's blood ran cold. "Are they coming because of me?" "We do not know," Stormhawk replied. "But the timing is unfortunate." Chief White Eagle emerged from his lodge already dressed for war with his ceremonial headdress and painted shield. Despite his age, he moved with the fluid grace of a lifelong warrior. He spoke rapidly with several of his war chiefs, then approached Jake. "This changes things," the chief said, his voice heavy with regret. "If the soldiers find you here, they will assume you have been captured, or that you have betrayed your own people. Either way, it will mean war." Jake's mind raced as he considered the implications. If he was found in the village, it would give the cavalry the excuse they might be looking for to attack. But if he tried to leave now and was spotted by the approaching soldiers, it might look like he was trying to warn the tribe or escape from captivity. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked. Chief White Eagle placed a hand on his shoulder. "I want you to choose here and now which path you will walk. You can ride out to meet the soldiers and tell them you were never our prisoner. Return to your old life and forget what you have learned here. Or you can stay and face whatever comes, as one of our people." The choice Jake had hoped to have more time to consider was being forced upon him by the approach of armed cavalry. He looked around at the faces surrounding him. Warriors preparing to defend their families, children being hidden in the safest teepees, elders standing proudly despite the danger approaching. In that moment, Jake realized that his decision had already been made the instant he gave water to Running Bear. Everything since then had simply been leading to this moment. "I stay," he said firmly. Chief White Eagle nodded, though sadness flickered in his eyes. "Then you must dress as one of us, and you must fight as one of us if it comes to that. Are you prepared for this?" Jake thought of his job at the Henderson Ranch, his small savings, his simple life among the cattle and endless grassland. Then he thought of Running Bear's gratitude, the kindness he had been shown in the village, and the possibility of preventing a war that would destroy innocent people on both sides. "I'm prepared," he said. Within minutes, Jake found himself being transformed. The tribal women painted his face with traditional designs, while the men provided him with Kiowa clothing and weapons. When they were finished, he looked in a polished metal mirror and barely recognized himself. The transformation was more than just physical. He felt as though he was stepping into a completely new identity. Running Bear approached him, carrying a magnificent war lance decorated with feathers and carved symbols. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said solemnly. "It has brought victory in many battles. Today, it is yours to carry." As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky, the cavalry appeared on the ridge above the village. Jake could see the blue uniforms and gleaming sabers of the soldiers as they formed a battle line. At their head rode an officer with silver insignia, probably a colonel or major, his face set in determined lines. Chief White Eagle mounted his own war horse and rode out to meet the approaching soldiers, followed by his war chiefs and most trusted warriors. Jake found himself riding alongside Stormhawk and Running Bear, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The two groups met in the open ground between the village and the ridge. The cavalry officer, a stern-faced man with gray hair and cold blue eyes, called out in a voice that carried across the morning air, "I am Colonel Morrison of the 7th Cavalry. We are searching for a missing ranch hand named Jake Morrison, who disappeared 2 days ago. We have reason to believe he may have been taken by hostile Indians." Jake's heart nearly stopped. Morrison. The officer shared his last name, which meant this search wasn't just about a missing ranch hand, it was personal. This must be a relative, probably an uncle or cousin he had never met, who had somehow learned of his disappearance and come looking for him. Chief White Eagle responded with dignified calm. "I am White Eagle, leader of this band of Kiowa people. We have taken no prisoners. We have broken no laws. Why do you bring soldiers to threaten peaceful families?" Colonel Morrison's eyes swept over the assembled warriors. and Jake held his breath as the officer's gaze passed over him without recognition. The war paint and traditional clothing had changed his appearance enough that even a blood relative couldn't identify him. Nevertheless, Colonel Morrison continued, "We will search your village. If this man is here, willing or unwilling, we will find him." "You have no authority to search our homes," Chief White Eagle replied, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious threat. "We are on treaty land guaranteed by your own government." Colonel Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Treaties are just paper, old man. They can be torn up as easily as they are written. Stand aside or we will remove you by force." Jake watched this exchange with growing horror. He could see the tension building in both groups, hands moving to weapons, horses sensing their riders' agitation and beginning to prance nervously. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would be spilled on both sides. That's when Jake made another decision that would echo through history. He urged his horse forward, past Chief White Eagle and directly toward Colonel Morrison. The movement caused a stir among both the soldiers and the warriors, weapons being raised and aimed as he approached the cavalry line. "Colonel Morrison," Jake called out, hoping his voice would carry clearly. "I am Jake Morrison, the man you're looking for." The colonel's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the painted warrior before him. For a moment he seemed unable to process what he was seeing. "Jake, is that really you, boy?" "Yes, sir," Jake replied, staying mounted but keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Uncle Samuel, I've been here as a guest, not a prisoner." The family connection was now clear to everyone present. Colonel Morrison was indeed Jake's uncle, his father's younger brother who had joined the army years ago. Jake hadn't seen him since he was a child, but the family resemblance was unmistakable now that they were face to face. "Good God, boy," the colonel said, his voice a mixture of relief and anger. "What are you doing dressed like a savage? Have you lost your mind?" The word savage caused several of the Kiowa warriors to stiffen with anger, and Jake saw Running Bear's hand tighten on his war lance. The situation was still balanced on a knife's edge. "These people saved my life," Jake said loudly, making sure both groups could hear him. "I was dying of thirst, and they gave me water and food. They've treated me with nothing but kindness and respect." Colonel Morrison's face darkened. "They've obviously filled your head with lies and nonsense. Get over here right now and we'll get you cleaned up and back to civilization where you belong." Jake looked back at Chief White Eagle, who sat motionless on his horse waiting to see what choice his young friend would make. Running Bear met Jake's eyes and nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to say, "Whatever you decide, we understand." "I appreciate you coming to look for me, Uncle Samuel," Jake said carefully. "But I'm not a prisoner here and I'm not ready to leave. These people have offered me something precious, the chance to be a bridge between our two worlds." The colonel's face flushed red with anger. "You've been brainwashed, boy. These people are nothing but murderous heathens who would scalp you in your sleep if it suited their purposes." "That's not true," Jake replied firmly. "I've lived among them, eaten with them, listened to their stories. They're people just like us with families and hopes and fears. The only difference is the color of their skin and the language they speak." Colonel Morrison looked as though he had been slapped. "I can't believe what I'm hearing. Your own father would be ashamed to see you like this." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "My father taught me to help people who needed help regardless of who they were. That's exactly what I've been doing." For several long moments, uncle and nephew stared at each other across the divide between two cultures. Finally, Colonel Morrison spoke again, his voice cold and formal. "Very well, Jake Morrison. If you choose to stay with these people, then you are no longer family of mine. But I want you to understand something clearly. This cavalry unit was sent here to relocate this tribe to a reservation in Oklahoma Territory. Chief White Eagle has 1 week to prepare his people for the journey. If they resist, we will use force." Chief White Eagle spoke for the first time since Jake had revealed himself. "And if we refuse to go?" "Then you will be considered hostile Indians in open rebellion against the United States government," Colonel Morrison replied. "And we will treat you accordingly." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jake realized that his personal drama had become secondary to a much larger conflict. The government was moving to force the Kiowa off their ancestral lands, and his uncle was the instrument of that policy. 1 week, Colonel Morrison repeated, then raised his hand to signal his troops. "We'll be back with a full regiment if necessary." As the cavalry began to withdraw, Colonel Morrison looked back at Jake one last time. Last chance, boy. Come with us now, or live with the consequences of your choice. Jake remained motionless on his horse, surrounded by the Kiowa warriors who had accepted him as one of their own. I've made my choice, Uncle. I just hope someday you'll understand why. The colonel turned his horse and rode away without another word, leading his soldiers back toward the ridge. As they disappeared over the horizon, Jake felt as though he had just burned the last bridge connecting him to his old life. Chief White Eagle moved his horse closer to Jake's. You have chosen a difficult path, young friend. The next week will test all of us in ways we cannot imagine. Jake nodded, understanding that the real challenges were just beginning. He had committed himself to helping broker peace between two peoples who seemed destined for war, and he had exactly 7 days to find a solution that could save lives on both sides. The week that followed the cavalry's ultimatum passed like a blur of desperate activity. Jake found himself caught between two worlds, trying to forge a path that could prevent the bloodshed that seemed inevitable. During the day, he worked alongside the Kiowa warriors to prepare defenses for the village, while at night he rode out to secret meetings with sympathetic ranchers and townspeople who might be willing to help negotiate a peaceful solution. The transformation in Jake was remarkable. The quiet ranch hand who had simply wanted to do his job and avoid trouble had become a determined peacemaker, driven by the knowledge that hundreds of lives hung in the balance. His ability to speak both languages and understand both cultures made him uniquely qualified to serve as a mediator, but it also made him a target for extremists on both sides. On the third day, Jake received an unexpected visitor at the village. Tom Bradley, the foreman from the Henderson Ranch, rode in under a flag of truce, his weathered face grim with concern. Jake, what in the hell do you think you're doing? Tom demanded as he dismounted near the central fire pit. Mr. Henderson is furious. He thinks you've lost your mind. Jake embraced his old friend warmly, grateful to see a familiar face even under these circumstances. I'm trying to prevent a war, Tom. These people don't want to fight. They just want to live in peace on land that was promised to them. Tom looked around the village, taking in the sight of families going about their daily routines, children playing games and elders sharing stories. It was clearly not what he had expected to find. They don't look like the bloodthirsty savages the newspapers write about, he admitted reluctantly. That's because they're not, Jake replied. They're just people trying to protect their families and their way of life. Over the next several hours, Jake introduced Tom to various members of the tribe, including Chief White Eagle and Running Bear. Tom was surprised by their intelligence, their dignity, and their genuine desire to avoid conflict. By evening, he had agreed to carry a message back to the surrounding ranches and towns. The message was simple but revolutionary. Chief White Eagle was proposing a new kind of treaty, one that would allow the Kiowa to remain on a portion of their ancestral lands in exchange for guarantees of peaceful coexistence with the white settlers. The tribe would provide scouts to help protect the area from hostile bands, and they would share their knowledge of the land and its resources. As Tom prepared to leave the next morning, he pulled Jake aside. You know this is probably impossible, don't you? There's too much fear and hatred on both sides. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but I have to try. If we can just get people talking instead of shooting, there might be a chance. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of secret negotiations. Jake found himself riding back and forth between the village and various meeting points, carrying proposals and counter-proposals between Chief White Eagle and a growing group of settlers who were willing to consider alternatives to war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria, the cook from the Henderson Ranch, had been quietly organizing the Mexican families in the area, who had their own complex relationship with both the Anglo settlers and the native tribes. She proposed a three-way alliance that would recognize the rights and contributions of all three groups in building a sustainable community. We've all been here longer than most of the new settlers, Maria explained to a gathering of representatives from each community. We know how to live with the land instead of just taking from it. Together, we could create something better than what any of us could build alone. The proposal gained momentum as word spread through the region. Families who had lived in fear of Indian raids began to see the possibility of having the Kiowa as allies instead of enemies. Ranchers realized that native knowledge of water sources and seasonal patterns could help them manage their herds more effectively. Even some of the local businessmen saw economic opportunities in peaceful trade relationships, but not everyone was pleased with these developments. On the sixth day, Jake learned that a group of militant settlers had sent their own message to Colonel Morrison, demanding that he proceed with the forced relocation regardless of any local agreements. They argued that allowing the Kiowa to remain would set a dangerous precedent that would encourage other tribes to resist government policies. That evening, as Jake sat with Chief White Eagle and the tribal council, discussing final preparations for the next day's confrontation, Running Bear brought disturbing news. "Our scouts report that your uncle's cavalry has been reinforced," he said. "There are now over 200 soldiers camped 5 miles from here, and they have brought artillery." The news sent a chill through the gathering. Cannons meant that the military was prepared for a full-scale assault on the village. Any resistance would result in a massacre. Chief White Eagle's face remained impassive, but Jake could see the weight of responsibility in the old chief's eyes. He was being forced to choose between his people's freedom and their very survival. "What do we do?" Jake asked. "We prepare for the end," Chief White Eagle replied quietly. "If we must die, we will die as free people on the land of our ancestors." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked through the village, looking at the faces of the people he had come to care about deeply. Children who would never grow up, warriors who would never see another sunrise, elders whose wisdom would be lost forever. The thought of losing them all was unbearable. As dawn approached, Jake made one final desperate decision. He saddled his horse and rode out toward the cavalry camp, carrying with him a letter that he had spent the night writing. It was addressed to his uncle, but its intended audience was much larger. The letter detailed everything Jake had learned during his week with the Kiowa people. It described their culture, their values, their genuine desire for peace, and their willingness to coexist with white settlers. But more than that, it challenged the fundamental assumptions that had led to this confrontation. Jake arrived at the cavalry camp just as the soldiers were preparing to march on the village. Colonel Morrison was surprised to see his nephew approaching under a flag of truce, but he agreed to read the letter before making his final decision. As the colonel read, Jake noticed other officers gathering around, drawn by curiosity about this unusual communication. When Colonel Morrison finished, he looked up at Jake with an expression that was difficult to read. "You've put me in an impossible position, Jake," he said finally. "My orders are clear. These people are to be relocated by force if necessary. But what if there's another way?" Jake asked. "What if the local settlers are willing to guarantee peace? What if the tribe agrees to specific terms that address the government's concerns?" Colonel Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of his officers. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out in his uncle's eyes. Duty versus conscience, orders versus humanity. Finally, the colonel made his decision. "I'll give you 1 hour," he said. "Bring me written agreements from both Chief White Eagle and the local settler committees. If you can demonstrate genuine support for an alternative solution, I'll send a telegraph to Washington requesting permission to negotiate rather than attack." Jake rode back to the village as fast as his horse could carry him, his heart pounding with hope and desperation. The next hour would determine whether his bridge-building efforts had been enough to prevent a tragedy that would scar the region for generations. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, representatives from all 3 communities, Anglo, Mexican, and Kiowa, gathered in the open ground between the village and the cavalry camp. They came together not as enemies, but as neighbors willing to try something that had never been attempted before. A true partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility for the land they all called home. The documents they signed that day wouldn't solve all the conflicts between their peoples, but they would provide a foundation for something better. And it all began with a simple act of kindness. A ranch hand giving water to a thirsty man without asking his name. Me or his tribe seeing only someone who needed help. Years later, when historians wrote about the unique peace that flourished in that corner of Texas, they would trace its origins back to that moment by the old creek bed. They would tell the story of Jake Morrison, the bridge builder who proved that even in the darkest times, one person's choice to see the humanity in others could change the course of history. The Kiowa village never had to move to Oklahoma territory. Instead, it became the heart of a thriving multicultural community that would serve as a model for peaceful coexistence throughout the American West. And at the center of it all was a simple memorial stone, marking the place where a dying warrior received water from a stranger, and where two worlds learned that they could become one.